Welcome back. In this video, we are going to talk about speech anxiety. More specifically, we are going to go over communication apprehension, impacts of communication apprehension, what makes an effective public speaker, and ways to overcome your speech anxiety. So, as I've mentioned in earlier videos, I tend to like to start with a quote. And so you have a quote here: fear can be a good thing as long as it's a counselor and not a jailer. And so we're going to come back to that a little bit. But if you think of thinking of fear this way, what is the difference between a counselor and a jailer? Well, a counselor will tell you about the pros and cons of doing something, right? Sort of proceed with caution, but it doesn't stop you from doing something. Now, if you think of a jailer is going to stop you, right? You're in jail. And so, what this quote's really trying to illustrate is that unfortunately, a lot of times in modern society, we let fear just be a jailer. We let it stop us from doing things, right? We don't even try because of our fear. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of negative results. So, we're going to talk about overcoming your fear. And part of that is just understanding don't let it be a jailer, let it be a counselor. So, in other words, recognize why it's there. What does it really mean? And how to then use it, leverage it to your advantage. So we'll come back to this quote as we kind of go through ways to overcome anxiety, but don't let fear be your jailer. Okay, so speech anxiety. First of all, this kind of falls under the umbrella of something called communication apprehension. And what communication apprehension basically means is it's fear or anxiety in any communicative setting. So this gets studied, and there's different ways that this gets researched as far as how do we know in terms of people in the field of communication, where does this tend to come up? Well, it tends to come up with people talking, obviously public speaking. That tends to be the number one fear when it comes to communicative settings. In fact, there's even studies that people will put public speaking as a top 3 or 4 fear, right, in their life. It's like they have death, house centipedes, which I don't like, and public speaking. It's like right up there. Okay. But other settings that we know that people have apprehension in are things like talking to authority figures, talking to strangers, talking to people that they're attracted to, right? Social settings, think of social anxiety, right? So it kind of comes up in all these different things, different areas. And so this question that you're being asked on the screen is, so why does this matter? Like, why care about it? Maybe you have the anxiety and you don't really take sort of active steps to manage it in a productive way. Again, to not drift, as I mentioned in an earlier video, there's a difference between going into a situation with a plan of action and trying to execute that plan versus I'm just winging it and I'll adjust on the fly and hope things work out for me, right? And normally that doesn't work. Normally you're just like shooting blind if you do that. So why would it matter to like have a plan to try to manage your anxiety? Well, here's what we know through research about like how does this negatively impact your life. So let's talk about personal settings. So research tends to show that if you have a lot of anxiety in communicative settings when it comes to just your interpersonal life, so this could be like talking to strangers, talking to people that you're attracted to, for example. People in those situations tend to have fewer relationships, and those relationships tend to not last as long. Okay. They also tend to report more problems in their relationships. These could be friendships, they could be intimate relationships, right? And more problems, and the quality is just not as strong, right? They don't really get as close to people, so to speak. And that kind of makes sense, right? That should be kind of intuitive that that happens because obviously, if you struggle communicating with people, one thing is it's hard to just meet people, right, and develop these relationships. And then once you get in them, it can be hard to resolve problems because you're not really communicating effectively with how you feel, right, and expressing concerns as they come up. Another issue is that in terms of the quality is it's just hard to express yourself, so therefore it's hard for people to get to know you and for you to get to know them, right? So pretty kind of obvious how those dominoes fall. In terms of the workplace setting, there's lots of research that shows that so workplace apprehension would be situations like anxiety in job interviews, anxiety talking to authority figures, strangers like customers, things like that, like cold approaching people that you have to do in a lot of workplace settings. And research basically shows you're less likely to get hired. If you do get hired, you're more likely to quit or get fired early on in a job. You're also less likely to get promoted. So, some of those situations, why does that happen? So, the job interview situation, that again, What happens there, the reason that could kind of maybe be a little, you can kind of see where this happens is somebody's nervous, so then they just don't perform well in the job interview, right? And then the employer, oftentimes, even though those nerves could easily be just interpreted as you're nervous and you really want this job, it doesn't say anything about your qualifications. Oftentimes, employers view it as a negative thing that you're not prepared, you're hiding something, or you don't perform well under pressure, and then they don't hire you, right? As far as quitting, getting fired early on, what happens there is you tend to get into a new job, especially in the early stages when you're trying to get comfortable and you're trying to figure things out. You are much more likely to quit or get fired during that stage. So the firing thing is just you make a mistake, you're not comfortable communicating with people, so you don't really try to like seek out the answer to solve it maybe readily. Maybe you don't want to approach your boss, you don't want to approach the coworker, and so you just keep making the mistake, or the mistake gets compounded and you get fired, right? Or you don't work well with the customers because you're nervous, and so you're just not doing well at that, so you get fired, right? As far as the quitting thing, this is kind of deals like it's basically an effect that is in all of us in this sense. So it doesn't have to be a job, but just think of it, anything again in life. Learning's remembering. A lot of times we know these things, we just never thought of them in this context. So in life for everybody, whenever you quit at something, it's easier to quit early on in whatever you're endeavoring. Now, why is it easier to quit early on? Because you don't have anything invested, right? You don't got a lot into time, effort, you name it, and so it's easy to walk away. So remove the anxiety thing for a second. Anybody, when you're at a job, when you're more likely to quit, when you've been there for 2 weeks or 2 years, the person who's been there for 2 years is less likely to quit because they've got something invested, right? They may not love the job, but it's the devil they know, right? It pays well enough to pay their bills, or they could. There may be aspects about it they don't like, but they're comfortable. They kind of know the routine. They're more likely to stay. Anybody, whether they have anxiety or not, when they're 2 weeks into a job, you are way more likely to just walk off. Like a customer's rude to you, right, at the end of your shift, and you just quit, right? Like people or you have a bad experience, or your manager's kind of a jerk, you're way more likely to just quit in week two because you don't have a lot invested here, right? Well, what happens is when somebody has a lot of anxiety in the workplace in these situations, whether it's communicating with coworkers or customers or you name it, they tend to stay in that sort of nervous, I'm still learning the ropes kind of period longer. And so they're just more likely to quit because they're just not comfortable. It takes them longer to get comfortable. So they're in that little window of I'm not comfortable, and if this goes bad, I'm just going to quit kind of scenario. As far as less likely to get promoted, what that kind of deals with is basically you're nervous, so people sense that when you're communicating with other people that you have some apprehension going on, and therefore it's about image. I'd mentioned in an earlier video that um, image and perception matter because they're other people's reality, right? And they're basing their viewpoints of you and how they and their decisions towards you based on that reality, right? Well, that's kind of coming back into play here. What happens is you communicate with a lot of apprehension in the workplace, so people just don't perceive you as the ideal manager or CEO, like Captain CEO, right? If we were to describe like this ideal manager in a lab, uh, most people say things like they're confident, they're assertive, they're knowledgeable, they take charge, right? They galvanize people. Actually, a lot of the factors that people will say is an ideal public speaker, right? And so if you're just very apprehensive when you talk to people, you don't make eye contact and you're stuttering, or every time you give your opinion, you hedge it. You say, well, it's just my opinion, but I'm not saying Susan's wrong, but I think we should do. You kind of say it a little meekly. You don't come across as Captain CEO, right? And so therefore the image of you is like, well, you're just not management material and you don't get promoted. So there's a lot of ways that apprehension really can kind of affect you in a negative way. Now, again, we're gonna get into like, are these fears logical? Because you can make a lot of arguments that a lot of the fears that we have in these various settings are not logical at all. They're not rational. Okay. And so we're gonna kind of get back into that. But this is the way those fears can kind of affect you. Okay. So that's what communication apprehension is, and that's what we're sort of focusing on in this class. Obviously, we're going to focus on public speaking. So I got this question up here, and I always ask this question to classes in person, which is, or very early on, what makes a good public speaker? So we're talking about the best presenters. Okay. And, we could be talking about a speech. We could be talking about, it could be really any kind of format where you're being persuaded by rhetoric, where somebody is speaking to you. So, I mean, this could be a YouTube video, right? It could be anything where you're getting that message and they're trying to convince you. So what is that person, right? And you have a class. Well, typically you say, so what is this? And they'll list various things. Okay. And here's what they'll basically say. So you got these categories here. So, and these kind of like dovetail, they can get more specific, but here's usually what people say. They will say things like, let's just start out with the content. The content is actually valuable. So it's information that is impressive, or it's the stuff I hadn't thought about before, or it's just the information I was seeking, right? You're actually delivering from a content standpoint. It's valuable and it's impactful. It's useful in my world. So there's that. And then also, just from the presenter standpoint, is we're focusing on them being good at delivering this message, right? So really focusing not just on the message, but the messenger. People will say things like they know their stuff, right? Think about it. If somebody is talking to you about a topic you know a lot about, like a hobby, okay, that you're really interested in, the minute they say something off, you're going to catch it. And aren't they going to lose some credibility with you? Like, I'm a big baseball fan. Okay, it's my favorite sport. I have a favorite team. I've been following it for decades, right? If somebody says something, we start talking about baseball, and they say they're a fan, and they tell me their favorite team. If they say something that's pretty wildly off, they're going to lose some credibility with me in terms of like their level of fandom, right? Because it'd be like, well, you must not follow it that closely because what you just said is pretty far off, right? On what's going on in baseball, right? So you have to feel like they know their stuff, and also that they deliver it in that way. And that could be everything from using terms correctly, right? Not making missteps in like sort of just broad comments about the topic, not saying stuff that is patently wrong. Okay, things like that. So obviously there's a content element. Effective nonverbal. So people will look at things like, do they come across as honest, as competent, as friendly? And we're going to talk about how, obviously, in this class with delivery, how to use your nonverbals in that way to try to have people perceive you as honest and competent and friendly. But they'll say that they want to see those things come across, and that's everything from gestures to eye contact to facial expressions, all these sorts of things. Effective verbal. So they'll look at same thing, honesty, competent, impactful, respectful in their language, how they describe things, that sort of stuff. They do it in a way that isn't that's sensitive to people, right? That isn't tone deaf, meaning they're not using words or phrases that could be offensive, or that audience could take the wrong way, or have a, and I'm not I'm or just even, let's say you walk in the room and the audience believes A and you're trying to convince them of B. So you're really going counter, right, to what they believe. Did you do it in a way that makes it most likely to be effective, right? It's not very effective if you come in the room and you say, again, you want them to believe B and they believe A. It's not very effective if you just say, well, you're an idiot for believing A and you should believe B. How stupid of you, right? That's not going to work, right? People get defensive. So do you use language when I say, is it respectful? I'm not talking about being PC, right? That's a cop out. When people get mad, they're like, well, that's too PC. No, what we're talking about is getting the job done, being effective, being a persuader. And at the end of the day, you're not going to be a persuader if you walk in the room and just offend people. If they're not going to listen to you because they're pissed off and defensive, then at the end of the day, you didn't get your job done as a persuader, as a presenter, right? So I'm not talking about being PC. What I'm talking about is communicating with them in a way that they can hear your message and listen, right? And sometimes that means approaching the topic in a way that is going to be a little more sensitive and, again, just not tone deaf to the situation, right? Read the room is basically what I'm saying. And we're going to talk more about that. But basically, audiences report they want that for the most part, right? In most situations. Appropriate arguments. So audience will say that person isn't using a bunch of fallacies. They're not just stating things that aren't true. They're using all types of arguments. We're going to talk about this later with persuasion. But there is research that suggests that people are more likely to believe something if you prove it to them in multiple ways, right? And that's using all the arguments. That's logos, ethos, pathos. Those are Aristotle's three proofs, which are basically appeals to logic, appeals to emotion, and appeals to ethics or morality. Okay, and we're going to get into that. But audiences kind of want to see that. And then this broad one, this is actually the one that most students really mention a lot, is connectivity. So what are we talking about here? On a really broad perspective, we're talking about charisma, really, essentially, right? The ability for the audience to be drawn to you as the presenter. So it's really something like that. And that's hard to bottle, right? It's hard to even describe, yet alone capture what that is, but it's basically somebody that people are drawn to. So that could be everything from charisma to they just motivate people. They're just somebody that people find motivating and how they lead kind of stuff. So we're getting into almost like leadership style that comes across, or this could also include things like passion for the topic. I think that this presenter really cares and believes in their message. And these are all the things that people say makes a good public speaker. Okay. So hold on to this. We're going to come back to this in just a few minutes here. Now, the second side of this that I will ask people is kind of the flip, which is like, but even more specific. So the exact flip would be what makes somebody a bad public speaker, right? A poor public speaker. But I want to get more specific dealing with, since we're talking about anxiety, is basically what are people afraid of? So I will then tend to ask the class, so tell me what can go wrong. Like, what are the scenarios that people are afraid of? And here's what they tend to say. They will usually talk about things either with the audience, their delivery as the presenter, or preparation problems, right? Or problems related to preparation. So let's talk about preparation delivery because they kind of go together, right? So basically, the person didn't prepare very much, right? Or they were nervous. Like, think of like people that have anxiety. I mean, you've probably experienced this. People have anxiety about something, so they put it off. So, like, since we're talking about college classes, people have test anxiety, so then they don't study for the test, right? And the problem, of course, is that just builds more anxiety because then now you're going to have to cram for the test, and then you cram for the test, which adds more pressure to you. And then that makes it harder to pass the test, right? And the irony is, in these situations where you're having anxiety, if you just would start studying for the test early, right away, the anxiety would actually go down because you'd start to see, oh, I'm getting this. And even if I'm not getting this because I started early, I have time to catch up, right? I don't have to cram and I'll figure it out. But we tend to procrastinate and we avoid it. Well, the same thing happens with public speaking. So people are nervous about a speech, they put off doing it, and then they cram at the end. So you didn't really prepare the right way, and therefore you're more nervous during the presentation, right? So then you start the presentation, and that can then make it more likely for all these terrible things to happen during the delivery. So what could go wrong during the delivery, right? What's the worst that could happen? So what do people say? Well, they'll say things like, I get up there and I freeze. I mean, can't talk. All the way from completely freezing to I'm forgetting things consistently, right? Or I forget to use my visual aids. Or I drop my note cards and now they're like scattered everywhere. I make a mistake I mispronounce something and people kind of like react funky to me, right? Because of that. They're giving me dirty looks and that sort of stuff. So that's what people will say. They will say that they're exhibiting nervous twitches. So that could be things like putting their hands in their pocket or not making eye contact, or they're nervous about making eye contact. They're stuttering a lot. So these could be verbal, they could be nonverbal. They're pacing. They start to do those types of things that kind of show their nerves. So basically, it's like the audience can see that I'm nervous. So they'll basically say things like that, or that I'm flush, or like they can just see the nerves. So these are kind of some of the delivery things. Typically, it's I'll forget, or they can see my nerves. Okay, something like that happens. Now the audience. What do they say about what could go wrong with the audience? Well, obviously, the classic example is the audience hates me. Everybody hates me. Okay, they're asking questions that are argumentative. They're not really questions; they're statements. They get mad. They don't want to listen. They're bored. That kind of stuff. Or I look out the audience and they're just not paying attention. Those are kind of all the things that they will say. Okay. All right. So these are the scenarios that most people put out. Now, here's kind of why I'm going through this, and this goes back to the whole counselor versus jailer quote. Okay. So let's stay focused on the fears, then we'll go back to what makes a good public speaker with that quote in mind. Okay. So in terms of the fears, you know what people just that's what people usually say. And you know what they just listed? They just listed the worst case scenarios, the doomsday scenarios. Now here's the thing. Those scenarios could happen. They're absolutely plausible. I have seen people not be able to talk. I have seen people give speeches to audiences where it was clearly offensive to that audience, right? Um, I've seen people do things where it's pretty clear they're nervous, like drop the note cards. I've seen them forget to look at their visual aids very clearly, nervously, like they're leaning, like they're about ready to fall over. I've seen all of this stuff happen. It can happen, right? It's very plausible. But here's the question: is as far as the counselor jailer thing, is it likely? Is it probable? And the answer is no. I have taught hundreds of students in college level public speaking classes, including advanced public speaking classes, right? These are communication majors, they've taken multiple courses. And I'm telling you, it's not hundreds, actually, it's thousands. Of the thousands of those students over all the years, only two just couldn't talk. Just flat out froze to the point where they couldn't talk. And by the way, one, we kind of knew it was going to happen ahead of time because they had already approached me. They had talked to me in private. Hey, I really have a lot of this anxiety. And so we kind of knew that it might happen and we were going to give it a go. She wanted to give it a go anyway, right? I've seen a couple students give speeches that are beyond counter to that audience. It's just completely counter to their interests. And even in those scenarios, the it's not like the audience gets up and just mutinies, right? I'll give you an example. I had a student once. This was at a four-year university. This was a communication major. So, if you don't know, communication majors is like foreign level class, advanced public speaking class. Communication majors tend to mostly be female. And by the way, in college, there's more women in college than men. So this class was mostly female. It's a college class and it's a communication major. It's a major that tends to be mostly female. So he's in there and he gets up and he gives a speech. And he gets about a minute to 2 minutes into the speech, and it's pretty clear that the basic gist of this speech is, ladies, your life ambitions should essentially be, in the kitchen bearing children. Okay. Now, there are people that are receptive to that message, but that is probably not his audience. I mean, you're saying that to women in college. I'm not sure if they think their career life aspirations should be that. They may think that that's an aspiration. They may want to get married. They may want to have children. But he was saying that should be your only aspirations, right? That was his speech. Now, the first 2 minutes, I would say the audience, they're kind of trying to figure out, is he kidding or what's happening here? Right. And then once they realize he's serious, now what happened? Now look, I don't think he got any dates in that class. I don't think it helped his social life. But it's not like the crowd just got up and mutinied, right? It's not like they all just got so pissed and just right there started shouting him down. That generally doesn't happen, right? And that's an example. That's probably the best example I can think of where somebody just clearly gave a speech that is, it has an audience, I'm sure, but it doesn't. Not in front of, not in a college class. Like they're not going to be receptive to that. I think almost any major wouldn't be receptive to that, right? And so the audience just doesn't react that way. So when you give a speech, even if the audience doesn't agree with you, they don't just like start throwing tomatoes at you. Like people don't walk around carrying eggs in their pocket and just hurling at them at people, right? Although I've thought of, to be honest, keeping eggs just in my car, and I kind of want to throw them at people that leave their carts in parking spots because I don't know who you are, but I don't know. Seems like a scourge on humanity that you think this is okay. So, I'm sorry, I digress. Look, people don't do that, right? So even when you give a speech that they don't like what you're telling them, they don't want to buy what you're selling. The audience tends to not react that way. Oh, and by the way, you have some control over that, right? Like you can again present the message in a way that's the least offensive as possible. Even when people are maybe not interested, so let's say they're bored, they generally still try to be respectful throughout your speech, right? They don't try to do things to make you uncomfortable. So the audience doesn't usually react that way to things, but yet that's what we're worried about. So again, these things can happen. They're plausible, they're not probable. And this goes back to that quote. And this is an illustration. If you think about your life, it doesn't have to just be public speaking, of how fear impacts most of our lives in general. The problem is this is how we let fear this is what happens with fear. Just like with public speaking here, when we're afraid of something, we are always thinking the worst case scenarios instead of what's likely going to happen. And you can't live your life that way. And here's why you can't. If you're going to live your life that way, then the odds are you would have already not done something you probably did today. You know what it was? Get in your car. Because statistically, that's the most dangerous thing you're ever going to do in your life. It's more dangerous than getting on a plane. Is getting into a car wreck. But you didn't say, well, I can't go outside because I could get hit by lightning, and that's the worst case scenario. And I'm not going to get my car because I could get into a car wreck, and that's the worst case scenario. But it's also statistically the most likely scenario of the worst case scenarios, right? You didn't live your life that way, right? So we don't do that with other things, but yet when it comes to things like public speaking or meeting or talking to somebody new or going for that job or that promotion, we let the worst case scenario fears, the doomsday, it's like we become Chicken Little and we're so scared of the sky falling that we let fear be a jailer instead of a counselor, right? And you can't do that. These things that we're worried about with public speaking, they are just not likely to happen. And if you prepare the right way, and we're going to talk about speech organization, and even today we're going to talk about some of these prep things you can do with anxiety. But if you do these things, they're even more or less likely to happen, and you're going to be more confident. Okay. So there's a way to fix this. And that goes into this second part right here that you see on your screen about what makes a good public speaker. So here's the thing about this list. The good news is, guess what? Everything on this list, it's teachable. You can create it in a lab. It can be artificial. Don't panic. It doesn't have to be organic. Okay? What do I mean by that? There are going to be people that are naturally more charismatic than other people, right? They're just born they're born as good, better public speakers. They're good in a crowd, and they have a lot of charisma. You know, there's people like that, but you can teach it. You can teach those techniques. We're going to talk about nonverbals, right? You can teach people when you meet somebody new and you judge them on your nonverbals, right? It's been suggested, there's research that shows there's about 10 categories, but you can kind of break them down into really broader categories. But we can teach you the things to do with your nonverbals to get into the friend category, to get into the honest category, to get into the I trust this person category. You can teach these things. You can obviously teach how to give valuable content. You can teach people how to present things in a persuasive way, in a way that connects with them, right? And obviously, you can teach them how to use their language correctly and the correct types of arguments. So, where I'm going with this is your fear and anxiety with public speaking. On one hand, you're probably afraid of the worst case scenarios, which really is an irrational way to live your life. And on the other hand, the things that make somebody good, we can create in within you if it's not already there, or just enhance what's there. In fact, the only one of these that's debatable if you can teach it is connectivity or charisma. Okay, and that's kind of debatable because they'll do studies on this too, where you ask people and you even ask people in the field, do you think you can create that in a lab? And it's debatable, right? Half people say yes, half people say no. I kind of think you can. And the way I like to look at that is look at, it's basically the classic, it's the classic example of, the reason I think that you can is because let's look at pop culture. Okay. If you go back, say, 5 years, this could be music, movies, you name it, something with pop culture. You go back 5 years and you take whoever the it guy or girl was or is, whoever was popular, and you skip ahead 5 years and they're no longer popular and somebody else is popular. Okay. And half the time, the person who was popular 5 years ago, everybody pretends they never liked them, but they did. Right. So it keeps changing, in other words. There's always a new it guy or girl emerging. And they tend to be different. Okay, so the it guy or girl from 5 years ago or 8 years ago tends to be different from whoever's the it guy or girl now, right? And then, of course, then there's always the circle back. So it's like we build people up, we then tear them down, pretend we didn't like them, and then they come back, and now they're cool again, and now we're like, yeah, I was never a hater. Um, so here's the thing about that: they tend to be very different, right? And if they're very different, what that suggests is that whatever is charismatic or whatever draws people in, that tends to be a pretty large box because you got people on this corner, and then 5 years later, there's somebody who's really different. They're over on this corner, right? So it's a big box. Well, if it's a big target, you know what that means? Is if I'm trying to hit that target, I'm trying to become that. It means I can throw a dart and I'm much more likely to hit the target because it's a large target. Well, if it's a large target and I'm more likely to hit it, that means I'm more likely to achieve it, which means it's more likely we can create charisma in a box, like in a lab, right? That we can just teach you how to do it. So I think a lot of that deals with nonverbals, a lot of it deals with language choice, and we're going to go into all of that. So the basic sort of to bring this all back full circle is that you should not let really fear of public speaking is this kind of thing. It's like the monkey on our back, the monster that keeps growing and growing, and it's all smoke and mirrors. Meaning, it's a fear we really shouldn't even have because we're usually afraid of these worst case getting hit by lightning scenarios that don't happen typically. That you can be taught how to prepare to not allow to happen, and we're going to talk a little bit about those for the rest of the video. And secondly, the things that make somebody good at this, you can teach it. You can teach it. It's learnable for pretty much everybody. Okay. So don't let your fear of public speaking, become a jailer. All right. So what do you want to do in terms of how to reduce your anxiety? Now, again, we're going to go through a couple of steps here, but I'm also going to go through steps as you go through the sections. So as we talk about speech organization and preparation, and we talk about how to use outlines in your note cards and delivery, all of these aspects, there's going to be little tricks and tips to manage your anxiety. So we're going to come back to it, right? But I want to give you some basic things. All right, prepare in terms of content, delivery, and your perspective. Excuse me. Use stress management techniques. And remember, things often feel worse than they are. Now, if you're taking one of my classes, I've linked 2 videos talking about 6 mental tips and 6 behavioral tips to manage speech anxiety. And some of these will dovetail with those, right? So preparing in terms of content, delivery, and perspective. Here's what that basically means. You've got to practice your speech, right? Now, when you practice your speech, have a game plan. Don't just be drifting. So what I always like to recommend is practice the speech in parts. So practice just getting the introduction down well. Okay. Once you have the introduction done well, practice doing the introduction in your first main point. Practice doing your introduction in your second main point, then your third main point. When you can do that, practice doing all of that with your visual aids. So I'm adding layers, right, to what you're doing. Then practice with the visual aids and actually like standing up, not just sitting on your couch with the TV on in the background, right? Like actually delivering the speech. And if you can, to an audience. Practice recording yourself. So build it in steps. Now, why am I saying to do that? One, it's just more practical, right? You want to build upon success. And if you're trying to do everything all at once, it's obviously more opportunities for things to kind of go wrong. And then that can be very discouraging. You want to build upon success. Another reason why I'm saying to practice in parts is by doing this, it ensures that you practice the introduction the most. And that's in terms of speech anxiety, arguably the most important part. So when you watch those videos on mental tips and behavioral tips, one of the things that he mentions in there is that your anxiety is the largest in the first, like it rises the most in your cortisol, like the stress hormone, right? That rises the most in the first 60 seconds of a presentation or anxiety inducing communicative situation, right? So if you can get through that first minute well, if you can start off well, usually then it starts to snowball in either direction. So if it starts off well, then you start to build confidence, right? And then there's no stopping you, right? You tend to roll really well throughout the speech versus it starting off poorly. So I want to help set that up for you, right? For you to start off well. And on that note, he also mentions in there, I think, a good point, which is to visualize really in your head that first 30 seconds going well. And people talk, you've probably heard people talk about visualization before. And visualization, I don't know what the right word is. It sounds like, I don't know, there's a part of that sounds kind of touchy feely, like, visualize your success, and people kind of roll their eyes. But believe it or not, there is actual research that shows that works, right? With people who very successful people in a lot of industry and fields, that when they visualize, they do have a habit of doing that, and it does work for them. So you could argue it's anecdotal, but there is definitely information out there that suggests that works. So if you visualize that start going well and you practice it the most, that'll help you reduce your anxiety, right? In terms of your delivery, what that's really talking about is when you prepare, you want to try to prepare in the best, as close to the actual speech situation as possible to help like manage the kinks in your delivery. So in other words, practice using the visual aids. Be standing up, not just sitting in your couch, right? If you can, practice in front of other people or record your speech. Do not practice in front of a mirror. That is a misnomer that it's out there and irritates speech teachers. Uh, Now, the reason for that is because if you practice in front of a mirror, you're going to start to overscript. You're going to start scripting every little wink, every little smile, and you're going to come across as scripted. And as I mentioned in an earlier video, when you come across as scripted, you come across as insincere, that you don't really care about your audience, about your message. You don't really believe, you don't even believe what you're saying, right? You want to come across as authentic. So you don't want to be scripting in real time your gestures, right? You don't want to be scripting in real time every little wink, right? And every tone of voice fluctuation. You don't want to be scripting that constantly. So it's better to just record yourself so you can review it later or practice in front of other people, right? Now, um, as far as perspective, what that's really talking about, and he mentions this in the mental tips video, I believe, that you have to remember a couple of things. So one is just remember the audience is generally on your side, right? And if whether it's a classroom or a real world setting, because they don't want to hear a speech that isn't interesting, right? So they're going to start out generally with a mindset of, well, let's hear what they have to say and be open about it. And certainly in a real world setting, they're definitely on your side, right? Because in a real world setting, if people are listening to your message, whether it's a speech or just a persuasive message, they're usually interested in listening to it because they're either interested in the topic, or if it's a business situation, because it involves their money. And people care about their money, and they want to keep it, not lose it, make wise decisions with it, and make more of it. And so they're going to be invested. They're going to listen to you, right? And they're hoping that this is useful and what you're telling them is real and right and something they can prosper from. And so they're going to be giving you the benefit of the doubt. And then, he mentioned this, and this has been borne out in all kinds of studies, that this notion of you're only really half as nervous as you feel. And that kind of comes across two ways. So, sticking with the whole audience thing here about your perspective, is guess what? The audience isn't going to catch everything. So just like when you watch a video on YouTube, or you're listening to a speech, okay, or you're hearing any kind of persuasive message, you're watching a show and they're just talking about something that you're interested in, or you're listening to a podcast. Okay, you space out. You don't catch it all, right? But you get the gist. Well, just like that happens with content, it happens with nerves too. So when you're giving the speech in your head, you're going to know every time you screw up for the most part. There's some automated things you're going to do because you're nervous that you're not always going to catch, but you're going to know if you really screwed something up a lot of times. And you're going to catch like the 5 mistakes you made. But your audience may only catch 2, right? Because they're not always 100% engaged. So they don't catch every mistake you make. And by the way, one of the ways we know that is because you can do post-presentation studies where you ask the presenter, how nervous do you think you were? How many mistakes on a 1 to 10? How many mistakes did you think you made? And then you ask the audience, how nervous do you think they were? How many mistakes do you think they made? And the audience always rates it lower, right? So in terms of perspective, the audience is probably on your side. Remember, they don't catch every mistake you make, right? Another thing about perspective that he also mentions in the video, and I will just reiterate here, is that a lot of that anxiety isn't always like bad. Some of it's nerves and some of it's just your body like getting ready to do something it knows is important. So for example, things that you want to do or that you're confident in, you still sometimes get anxiety. You just don't call it that. You know what it is? It's like adrenaline and dopamine because you're glad you're going to do this thing or you're confident in yourself or you're assertive and all that sort of stuff, right? Well, those a lot of times in our body, those chemical reactions are very similar. And when we're getting nervous for a speech, some of it is anxiety, sure, but some of it's just that. It's adrenaline, right? It's your body preparing itself to do something important. And even people that are really good at this, I'm also an attorney and I've been in front of a lot of juries and or even when I teach a class, I've taught all of these classes over the years. It's you always get a little bit of adrenaline or nerves when you first start, like even if you're experienced at this and confident at this, but not all of that is anxiety. A lot of it's just adrenaline and other things like to your body telling yourself to get ready to do something. So don't keep in mind that only like half of that's really anxiety. And it's not really bad anyway because everybody feels that anxiety. So have the right perspective when you go in. And then again, remembering things often feel worse than they are. That goes back to the audience thing. They don't catch everything, all that kind of stuff, right? Another thing about perspective, and he also again mentions this in the video, is you have kind of three things that you can focus on in a speech, and that is your message, your content, right? Your delivery, so you, right? How am I coming across? How am I coming across? What's the impression I'm giving? And then you have your audience. Okay. So you have all of these things going on. Focus on your message and your audience. So don't focus so much on you. Get out of that box and just focus on I'm going to deliver this message effectively, whether it's my language, my word choice, my arguments, and then my actual delivery. Focus on getting that as best you can and focus on am I tailoring this to the audience the best way? Am I approaching them the best way? And again, we're going to have a whole video, a whole discussion on audience analysis and all that sort of stuff. But if you start to focus on those things, stop focusing on you. You do those things. A lot of times that third domino will fall into place. You'll be good because you focused on how can I deliver a strong message, product, or service to my audience in the most effective way, and then you end up actually doing so very effectively in terms of your delivery. It comes across well because you're focused on them. You're focused on the right thing. So focus on the message, focus on the audience, not on yourself. And then use these various stress management techniques. So I've already talked about a couple, which is to practice in parts, record yourself, don't practice in front of a mirror, okay? Other things that make people nervous or that tends to create the biggest anxiety is things like, let's say, eye contact. So let's say you have a hard time with that. That's a big thing that a lot of people struggle with. And you've probably already heard, right? You don't have to take a college class to hear people say things like, well, look at their foreheads. I didn't mean to say that kind of sarcastic. Look at their foreheads, pick points around the room. Now, those things, you could do that some people do that and it works. I personally think that the better methods or the two best methods. So the second best one I think is you pick points in the room. Now the key with that is you got to pick a point in from each quadrant of the room. So the middle, right, left, and you just look at those points. And those points, whatever you pick, kind of need to be eye level, right? Because you're trying to give the illusion, right, that you're making eye contact. That perception for them, their reality that you're making eye contact even though you're not. I think that's a little better than foreheads, but because it reminds you to go across the room, right? Now, the best method I think, and this is what a lot of presenters get taught is what's called shrinking the audience, okay? And even people that are like stand-up comedians get taught this. So what shrinking the audience is you come into the room and let's say there's 30 people and you just pick three people, one from each section of the room, the middle, right, left, and you just look at them. You just go to those three and give the speech. And everybody else just kind of blends in. If you have friends in the class, people that you think will be really paying attention and on your side, pick those three people. Now, if you, an even better thing to do would be you pick those three people maybe for the first half of the speech, and then the second half you pick another three, or you pick three different people for each main point and just focus on them. That will give a great illusion of eye contact with everybody, and you're only focusing on 3 to 6 people throughout that speech or whatever it may be, right? And that's how a lot of comedians are trained. I mentioned people that do like TED Talks in front of hundreds of people, stand-up comedians are trained to do that because they're in front of like 200-300 people, if not more, right? And it's just a good way to give that illusion and still do it. So use that technique in terms of the eye contact. Little other subtle things to keep in mind. If there is a clicker or a laser pointer and you're giving that presentation, let's just pretend that the pen is the laser pointer. You want to hold that in your non-dominant hand. So I'm right-handed. Most people are right-handed. But if you're left-handed, just reverse this. So I'm right-handed, so my dominant hand's my right hand, right side. I'm going to hold it in my left hand. Now, why is that? Well, it's because when you're nervous or just when you're just naturally gesturing, you're more likely to do so to lead with your dominant hand or side. So I'm more likely to talk like this because I'm right-handed than to do this. This just feels awkward, okay? I'm also more likely, by the way, if I'm facing the audience, I'm going to turn to do something. I'm more likely to turn this way than I am to do this, right? So there's a phrase with delivery. I'll come back to this in other videos, which is that good delivery is delivery not noticed. Good delivery is delivery not noticed. And what that means is you don't want them to see what you're doing. Okay. Not everything, some things you want them to notice, but so I guess that should be a caveat quote. But a lot of things what they're talking about is a lot of things you don't want them to know what you're actually doing to look so much smoother, right? And so it's like a little cheat. Well, here's the deal. If you naturally gesture with your dominant hand, if you're holding the clicker for the PowerPoint or your note cards in that hand, you're drawing attention to it. You're going to be waving the note cards around in front of them. And you don't want them to notice you have note cards, right? So hold them in your non-dominant hand. You're less likely to wave them around. Okay. If you have a choice, and we don't always control this, but if you're in the room, if you have a choice, and like, again, you're right-handed, you actually want to have the visual aids on your right-hand side. Because again, if you're nervous or you're just naturally going to take a step that's like kind of away from the audience, you're more likely to turn to the right if you're right-handed or to the left if you're left-handed. So if the visual aids are like right there, I am more likely then to sort of naturally go to the visual aids. It's easier for me. It's smoother when I want to refer to them. Or if I just nervously step away from the audience, at least it looks like I'm turned to the visual aids. So it doesn't look like I nervously turn my back. It might look like I'm referring to the visual aids. And if you have to refer to the visual aids to help remind you of something, now that doesn't look out of place. It just looks like this person's referring to the visual aids. So again, it's them not noticing little subtle things you're doing to make yourself look smoother. And in fact, I like to, it's maybe not the best way to phrase it, but one of the things that as I go through each section and with public speaking that I tend to talk about is everything in a speech, whether it's how you prepare, your use of your visual aid, your note card, your actual instruments, and then how you actually even interact with the audience can be used to cheat. Everything can be used to cheat. And what I mean by that is make you look naturally smoother, right, than maybe you really are. Okay. And so those are some other subtle things. Like really more advanced stuff is like, let's just say you have a tendency to have a lot of like nonverbal tics. So that's like touching your face, biting your nails, swaying, leaning on something, that kind of stuff. One little trick you can do is pick 2 fingers on either side and during the speech hold them together. Like consciously pay attention to that. Now, why is that? Well, one is gesturing like this is there's actually research that shows that people think you're more confident in what you're saying. I believe what I'm saying, right? But the real reason I'm telling you to do that is if your brain has to focus on that while you're speaking, you are less likely to engage in the tics. So the biting your nails, the doing this. I once had when I was in college, I had a professor who every time he asked a question, he would scratch his head and pat it twice. He would do this weird thing. And he didn't even know he was doing it, right? He was giving these lectures. It was one of these like classic college. like huge lecture halls, right? Like 200 people. It's like a movie theater kind of thing. It's like in an auditorium. And he's up there with the mic, and he would do that every time, right? And sometimes we're not aware that we're doing these things because we're kind of doing them automotively, like so they're just happening subconsciously. So if you do this, it kind of tells your brain you can't be on autopilot. I got to focus on something, and it stops some of those ticks, like putting your hands in your pocket or leaning, right, or doing this kind of stuff, the nervous stuff, right? And so that's what you kind of want. That's the reason you want to do that. Another little subtle trick. I don't expect you necessarily to employ this, but just to give you an idea of some subtle things people will do is they will, for example, take say, let's say you sweat a lot. Okay, you get really nervous and you get flush and you sweat. They will take like a coffee cup but they'll put a cold drink in there instead of coffee. So imagine this was a Starbucks cup. I am pro coffee. And they will put something cold in there and then they'll hold that cup now every once in a while during the presentation in their non-dominant hand. Now, why is that? Well, this is just using, right, taking biology and leveraging it to your advantage. So where do we lose heat? In your extremities, your hands and your feet, your face. So when you're sweating like that and you're getting flush, you're basically your body's overheating a little bit. That's part of why. So again, if one of your extremities has to hold something cold, you're less likely to get sweaty and flush. So that's a trick I've seen people use. That that's a tough one. It's easier to use that in my opinion if you're doing a presentation that's more of like it's not really a speech, but it's more like a conference room and you're gathered around and you're at a table. Because you're at a table and you're holding a cup, it's less awkward. If you're giving a speech and you do that, depending on how long it is, that could be a little awkward. So, but I'm just so in other words, and it's certainly not something you do maybe in a class, but I'm just letting you know as just like a pro tip that presenters get taught and that sort of stuff. So these are just some of the stress management techniques that you can do. And by the way, this is another good reason to record yourself is because again, just like that teacher I was telling you about, sometimes we're just not aware of the ticks we have. We're not aware of the things that we're doing, whether it's nonverbal or verbal. Verbal are things like they're basically called verbal pauses. So there's people that say like, that sort of stuff. You sometimes aren't even aware you're doing it. And so a good way to get aware of that is to actually record yourself. So that's another reason to record yourself. So I hope that all of this was really helpful in terms of you understanding sort of how to manage public speaking anxiety. And again, just remember that a lot of the things that we're afraid of are worst case scenarios. They're not likely to happen. And the things that make somebody a really good presenter, it can be taught. And I'm pretty confident that everybody in this class, at least in my experience, has that ability to become a really good presenter once they adopt those techniques. So your fear in this area should be a counselor, meaning take it seriously, proceed with caution, but you're capable of this. Don't let it be a jailer. So thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.